Amen. All right, now someone's going to have to explain it. I have not seen and have not heard what happened with Jim.
Fell, it's cracked.
Okay.
I think Justin's putting work.
Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Need to remember him for sure. We are in 1 Corinthians. Good to see everyone. We spoke last week just as we were getting going about the first few verses here in 1 Corinthians. And we looked at somewhat the introductory remarks, but at the same time, verse 4, I thank my God always concerning you for the grace of God. And I thought I'd start off by saying what Brace touched on in Wednesday night's invitation. I hope you don't think that I'm trying to say Paul did not love the Corinthians and the Lord did not love the Corinthians. Paul, he's actually, and me and Brace were talking about it afterwards, he's going to use the idea later on in chapter 4, I believe, verse 15, for though you might have 10,000 instructors in Christ, yet you do not have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I have begotten you through the gospel. How much do you think Paul loved them? I mean, he goes, like we already talked about, he goes from Thessalonica to Berea to Athens, and he was in Corinth for a significant amount of time. And he very much loved the Corinthians. Now, at the end of 2 Corinthians, he's going to say, the more I love, what? The less I am loved. And we'll say this. Were the Corinthians loved? Yes. Were the Corinthians themselves having love problems? Yes. That was very much the case. And we'll talk about that as we go along. So let's come on to verse 10 is where we left off. Verse 10. Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you. Now I say this, that each of you says, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest anyone should say that I had baptized in my own name. Yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. Besides, I do not know whether I baptized any other. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. Okay, so we have basically the topic for, you're almost tempted to say, looking at the outline, the first 4 chapters. In reality, it's not the first 4 chapters, it's everything. And he comes out of the gate and he's addressing the, sometimes joy after I preached a hard, sorry Joy, I know I'm not supposed to call you out by name. But anyway, sometimes Joy, when I've preached something and she'll say, thank you for addressing the elephant in the room. What's the elephant in the room in Corinth? It's been reported, right? These divisions are happening. Why, and I thought just to kind of get us going and talking a little bit, why does he lead with this? Cobwebs, clear them out. Why does he lead right out of the gate? Go ahead, Joel. I want you to explain your hand gesture. And I really do mean that.
I mean, like, basic. It is foundational. And
foundational for what?
For anything else they're going to do. Any more growth, you got to do this first.
Right?
Yes.
Everything hinges on this. Everything hinges on this. He's going to say, right? He said, be of the same mind, be of the same judgment. We'll talk about that here in just a second. First, go ahead, Andrew.
We talked last week about Paul's intro to the letter about establishing his apostleship as a way of setting the authority for the letter. Well, if he knows that these people have a problem with latching on to personalities and latching their faith onto who taught them or who converted them, he runs the risk of people hearing Paul proclaim his apostleship and then some group of people saying, well, since I'm of Paul, I'm going to, and he says, I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you so that you don't do this.
Right.
But he runs the risk of people latching on to the personality of him as an apostle rather than the message. So I think that's why he probably starts here is, yes, he just established I'm an apostle, but you ought not to be grafting yourself onto groups based on personalities and certain people.
Yep. And we'll come back to that as we go along. And just think about the chapter. Chapter 5, the immoral man. And what were they doing with the sexual immorality that was happening? They're just ignoring it, right? And just think about throughout the book, you have, suing the brethren. Could the divisions in Corinth, could that play a part in them suing one another? It could. You have 2 or 3 chapters about liberties. And liberties are all about relationships with one another. So could divisions cause issues with liberties? It could. Chapter 11, tarry ye one for another, the Lord's Supper. So was it affecting the Lord's Supper? It could. The gifts even. And you can tell they were zealous for the gifts, but they thought speaking in tongues. And the issue is, you have the gifts, but who has the gifts? Different members. So is that going to play a part in the discussion of the gifts? It's going to. And you just go right down the road, and we'll back up to chapter 5 in the immoral man. Why would you not be doing anything about something that Paul says even the Gentiles don't do this? And I was thinking about an analogy. You have, and we'll use the sports analogy first. Brace, what sport do you want me to use? Pick one. Don't say lacrosse. Football. You have a wide receiver that's dropping every ball thrown his way. You have a wide receiver who's not running his route right. You have a wide receiver who's just hot dogging it every chance he can. The moment, and what's one of the what's the word I'm looking for? 2 teams that hate one another. Isn't one of them the Packers and the Bears, if I remember right? Let's say you're on the Packers and you're coming after the Bears wide receiver, because that Bears wide receiver, he's not worth a plug nickel. But you're a Bears fan. You're a Bears fan, but your wide receiver, he's not a good player. But someone from the opposing team says something about your guy. What are you going to say? You don't say anything about my guy. Well, yeah, but he hadn't caught a ball since 2008. I don't care. You don't say anything about my guy. Well, yeah, but he's not. I don't say anything bad about my guy. We see this in politics too. There may be a politician who's not a good politician, but if he's on my party's ticket, then what am I going to do? Defend him, even though he may not be worth a whole lot, but he's got the right letter after his name. He's in my party. So anybody comes after him, don't you say anything bad about him. That guy in 1 Corinthians 5, if he was in one of these divisions, there's a pretty good, and the question is, why were they ignoring sin? Well, if they've divided up into these cliques, and this sinner's in my clique, don't you say anything about him. So could it even play a part there? What Paul just say? I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. That word judge is going to come up throughout the letter. One of the places it's going to come up is 1 Corinthians 5. Anyway, that was just to get the ball rolling a little bit. I just wanted you to think about why we start with this. It's because I think Joy's right. It's fundamental, it's foundational to everything. And I think Andrew's right as well. Paul started with his apostleship, but we're talking about personalities and different things as we go along. So we'll address that more. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was impressed with verse 10 there, where in the name of Jesus, Paul appeals to them to speak the same thing, do the same thing. That is the key to the whole letter, to the whole New Testament, is in the name or by the authority of Christ. He has it all in heaven and in earth. Now, whatever he says about a thing, that's it in time and eternity. Matthew 19, he said, I say unto you. So that settles it. Whatever he says, we better learn that, respect that, and submit to his authority in everything.
We cannot achieve unity outside of verse 10. We cannot do it. That's one of the problems with the ecumenical movement, that effectively says it really doesn't matter what you teach, it doesn't matter what doctrine you have, it doesn't matter what judgment you have. The problem with, and just for example, within denominationalism, as much as denominations like to play that they are united, okay, you have Baptists. The very word Baptist comes from the fact that from the foundation of their denomination, they taught it's believers who are baptized. And yet, you go to a Methodist or Episcopalian or Lutheran or Catholic denomination, and who is it who's baptized? Babies. Baptists don't believe in that. They don't believe it's right. So you have one Protestant denomination teaching one thing, you have other Protestant denominations teaching something else, and yet they both say, well, it's okay because we're united. If they were really united, would they be worshiping separately? It wouldn't happen. You can't have unity outside of verse 10. Speaking the same thing, no divisions, perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. That's how unity happens. Jesus, before he goes to the cross, prays to the Father for what? That the disciples would be one just as he and his Father were one. It is absolutely fundamental. All right, verse 11. Chloe. It has been reported by Chloe's household. There has been correspondence between Paul and the Corinthians. He's going to say later on, he's going to say the things, and it's within the chapter. You might look over at chapter 5, verse 9. I wrote to you in my epistle. So there has been previous correspondence from Paul to the Corinthians. And you see that other places as well. And here, he said, the one I'm thinking of that just about slipped my mind, in talking about marriage, chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me. So there has been correspondence both ways. And within that correspondence, you have individuals who had also reached out, and one of them is Chloe. So within that correspondence, Chloe says, this is what's happening. Here's the question. Was Chloe gossiping? Not easy questions, I know. Was Chloe gossiping? Chuck, you're saying no. You want to back that up anyway?
Well, I think it was pretty public knowledge what, this division, that they were calling each other, well, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos.
Wasn't a secret.
So I think gossiping is behind their back, talking behind their back and telling something that, maybe not true.
Perhaps, but not always. We'll say that.
Right, correct.
Yeah.
But I do think that, yeah. And also the intentions of that person gossiping or telling tales or whatever we want to say, they're doing it to kind of get back at somebody or, degrade,
tear
put
them
down.
Yep. And what's the purpose of Chloe's reporting?
I think just informing, to encourage, fix the problem that they have.
Yeah. Anyone want to add anything? Go ahead, Chris. We wait patiently.
I mean, we only get part of the picture here. We get what Chloe writes to Paul. It's possible Chloe had tried to deal with this himself, or in some way. And so, I mean, we don't know for sure what else had happened behind the scenes before Chloe writes to Paul about this issue. So, I mean, it's possible, it's speculation, but I mean, give people the benefit of the doubt unless you know otherwise. So,
I'm going to make the same point in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I think it'd be real easy to say, well, no one came to me privately. How could Paul jump the gun and say, deal with this when you're assembled? We're only getting part of the picture. There were, look over in chapter 4 at verse 19. Actually, verse 18. Chapter 4, verse 18. Now some are puffed up as though I were not coming to you, but I will come to you shortly if the Lord wills, and I will know not the word of those who are puffed up, but the power. Was everybody puffed up? Not everybody. Were there good folks in Corinth who were doing the right thing and trying to do the right thing? Yes. The fact that Chloe has reported this, what does this say about Chloe's heart? She's recognizing the problem. You think she was the only one recognizing the problem? I don't think it's likely myself. So I tend to agree with Brace. I know it doesn't say it, but they had probably tried to address some of these issues, and how far had they gotten? Still an issue. So at that point, and just as Chloe, look at it from Chloe's perspective. How disheartening would this have been for the disciples there and for Chloe? That would have been very disheartening, very discouraging, very frustrating. And she's probably pulling her hair out saying, how could we be going down this road? And she reaches out to hopefully the person who can do something about it. It's been reported to Chloe's household. And we'll say this. We've already read the verse. Paul sees himself as almost like a father figure to them. Okay, parents, you want to know what your kids are up to? You know, when I come home at the end of the day and I say, Steve, Lily didn't try to burn the house down, did she? Report. He wanted to know what was happening in Corinth. He had been there, there's travels going on, and this is what's happening. I think to Chuck's point, and I think this is really foundational to it, gossip tries to tear people down. Chloe is trying to get issues fixed. That's what she's trying to do. So the report has been made. And now we get into the interesting verse. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. I'll give you two takes, and one take is actually divided into two views. I'll give you one view. Here in come over to chapter 3. Come over to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is where he starts using Paul and Apollos. He uses himself and Apollos specifically. But then, and that's the one sows, one waters, God gives the increase, verse 6 of chapter 3. But then you get into chapter 4 at verse 6. It says, now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. That business about, I have transferred these things to myself. Let me get over there. I'll show you what that word means. In chapter 4 at verse 6, King James, I have in a figure transferred from those two from that compound word meaning to transfigure or disguise. Paul's saying, I have figuratively transferred these things to myself and Apollos. So that tells you from that passage specifically, if he's figuratively transferred these things to himself, are he and Apollos the problem? There's others. He is inserting, at least in chapter 3 and chapter 4, he is inserting his and Apollos' names in the place of someone else. Now I would suggest, looking back in chapter 1, does the same thing apply? Perhaps, not necessarily, but perhaps. But we will say this. It does seem odd, and I will say concerning, we'll come back to Andrew's point here in a second. Now I say this, that each of you says, I am of Paul, or I'm of Apollos. We've already read, Paul says, the more I love, what am I? The less I am loved. How did most of them, I don't know about most of them, some of them, how did they feel about Paul? So when we look at it from the view of, oh, well, there were folks there claiming to be Pauline Christians. Paul wasn't, he's going to say later on, I don't know if I can find it. It might be in 2 Corinthians. Let me look over real quick, see if I can find it. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 10 at verse 10. Actually, verse 8. For even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification, not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. So how is Paul viewed by some of them there? I don't know how many, but at least some of them. He's going to say in 1 Corinthians 1, in talking about judgment, he's going to say, if to paraphrase it, you can judge me all you want to, and that's okay. How were they treating Paul? Not very well, at least some of them. So, to look at that verse in chapter 4 about figuratively transferred, it's possible in chapter 1 he is inserting his and Apollos and Peter's names, and even we'll talk about the Christ one here in just a second. That's one possibility. It's not the only possibility. Some folks think that what was going on here, who was Paul sent to in the grand scheme of things? Gentiles. Now, if you're a Gentile, how are you going to feel about that? I'm going to feel pretty good about that. Who is Peter sent to? Jews. If you're a Jew in Corinth, how are you going to feel about that? I'm going to feel pretty good about that. Apollos, some of the things we know about him from early on, how good of a speaker is he? He's eloquent. He's a good speaker. Paul, well, his letters are good, but his speech, contemptible. And we really like good speakers. So if you really like a good speaker, who are you going to gravitate towards? Apollos. And then you have Christ. And to think about that idea, could even saying, I am of Christ be divisive? I think it could. If you say, I am of Christ and I'm better than you, then it's a divisive mentality. If you say, oh, you're of Paul, you're of Cephas, but I'm of Christ. Even I'm of Christ could be divisive, and that's verse 13. Is Christ divided? No. You could be saying the right thing, at least concerning I'm of Christ, but if your heart's not right, then there's an issue. That's just a possibility. Now, within that view, that some were gravitating towards Peter, some towards Paul, some towards Apollos, and then even Christ. A subdivision of that is some people think that Peter and Paul were actually opposed to one another, and that, well, obviously the two apostles were not getting along and they had different ideas. The problem with that is, who does Peter endorse? He's going to endorse Paul, and who does Paul extend the right hand of fellowship to? Peter. Now, granted, Paul's going to withstand Peter to the face when Peter's carried away with hypocrisy, but that's a subgroup of that view of, yes, people are actually gravitating towards these individuals. I think that one can be shown pretty clearly that that's not the case as far as Paul being opposed to Peter, at least when they were on the same page. Any questions or comments about those views? Go ahead, Andrew.
Just one brief thought
Yeah.
relating to the idea of I am of Christ. I don't know what the possibility is that there's anyone in Corinth who may have been a witness to Christ while he was alive.
It's not
It's not clear that there is anyone.
necessarily outside of the realm of possibility, though. It was written in the 50s, mid to late 50s AD. So 20 years.
Okay. So, it's possible. So maybe there could be grounds for someone to say, oh, I saw Christ in person, so I know better than you. But we also hear of people who, even today, will say, unless it's something that Christ spoke, the rest of the Bible is really just commentary or opinion, or you don't really have to take Paul's word as literal gospel. It's just, the idea of if it's not printed in red, that it's not directly from God. So you could also see how people might even then say, well, unless I know that Jesus himself said this, why am I going to listen to you? Now,
Yeah.
of course, that goes back to Paul introed the letter by saying, I'm an apostle of Christ.
I'm an apostle. The gifts are confirming these things. Miracles are confirming these things. I will say, I was thinking as you were speaking, 1 Corinthians 15 is about the resurrection. And Paul's going to, he's going to say he appeared to this person and then that person, these people, and then he appeared to however many hundreds there in 1 Corinthians 15. The closer we get to the destruction of Jerusalem 70, those Christians, after Stephen's stoning, where do they go? They scatter. Now, how far afield are they going to end up scattering? There's going to be hither and yon. They're going to be all over the place. So is it outside the realm of possibility that there were folks there from Judea? I don't think it's impossible by any stretch of the imagination. And thought Andrew's point was a good one as far as I'm of Christ and explaining that. Okay, verses 13 through 17. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in them? And Paul, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. Obviously, that means you don't have to be baptized, right? Because that is one of the ways this passage is used sometimes. If baptism, what they'll say, if baptism is so essential, then why would you have verse 17, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel? If baptism is not essential, then why wasn't Paul sent to baptize? Is the argument. How do you answer that? How could we answer that? Anyone? I would say the verse, yeah, go ahead, Brace.
His commission was to teach. Ultimately, the result of that is someone will obey.
But whether or not Paul is the one to immerse them or not is really irrelevant. I mean, it doesn't matter who does the immersing. It's the teaching aspect that Paul was commissioned for and specifically sent out for. So in this case, he's thankful that he didn't baptize very many because perhaps, at least with one of the views, people were lining up behind who baptized them.
Right.
Yeah, I was baptized by Brother Paul, and so that makes me a better Christian than you who were baptized by Peter. And so, I mean, Paul's commission was to teach.
If I could be baptized by anyone, right?
Yeah.
If you could take
I wanna
your
be
pick of
baptized by Paul.
baptizer, from the time baptism started, who are you going to pick? I'm going to pick Jesus, right? You want that fisherman from Galilee? You want me to be baptized by Peter? I don't want to be baptized by Peter. I mean, I know he's, one of the main apostles. He's one of the big apostles. Wait, you want me to be baptized by Bartholomew? I don't want to be baptized by Matthew, the tax. No, I want to be baptized by Jesus. How many people did Jesus literally, physically baptize himself? We're actually going to get to that. Well, it's in John chapter 4. The disciples baptized. He didn't baptize. Why do you think Jesus did that? I mean, I know he commanded baptism, but he didn't himself do the baptizing. Go ahead, Jim.
I thought that was strange that Paul would word that way. He sent me not to baptize. The commission says, teach all nations, baptize them, and then teach them.
Yep.
But anyway, I understand why Paul said what he said, but it seemed kind of strange to me over the years as I thought about it.
Yeah. The point of the passage is unity, right? That's the point. It's unity, it's fellowship, and there were divisions happening. The point of the passage is not, you don't have to be baptized. It can actually be shown, you can use the verse to show the necessity of baptism. What does baptism do? He's trying to get them back to the basics. 1 Corinthians 12 says we were all baptized into one body, which is again focusing on unity. Okay, so how do you get in that one body? He's not saying, oh, baptism isn't important. He's saying, when you were you baptized in the name of Paul? Were you baptized in the name of Peter or baptized in the name of Apollos? No, Christ is not divided. Who was it who added you to the church? Was it Paul, Peter, Apollos? No, it's Jesus. This is about unity, and where does our unity with Jesus begin? And that's the passage, right? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God I baptized none of you. The whole point of this is, we do not want the cross. The cross, to look at this passage, was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized? So crucifixion is tied in with baptism. The one who you're baptized in the name of better be crucified for you. And we are united in Christ in baptism. And the Corinthians needed to remember that. Go ahead, Chuck.
And that's just it. A lot of times we, count the numbers of baptism, and it's not just the act of baptism.
Right.
And he says, if you preach the gospel, it will be, the whole gospel includes baptism and the crucifixion. So that's really what he was going to do, preach that, and it didn't matter who was, again, if they truly were baptized for the right reason.
And we'll say this. I might repeat it. I'll wait. I'll pause. Go ahead, Greg. He's coming. Slowly. I won't say slowly.
He's doing fine.
Surely. He's just coming.
He's a lot faster than I would be. So when you first pose the question, how do you respond to this? I'm trying to think, my first response is, look at all the things Paul talked about besides just baptism. And you look in chapter 2, he said in verse 2, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Well, is that all he did? Was sermon after sermon about Jesus' crucifixion?
No.
Of course not. And so he's obviously using hyperbole to make a point. And if you're saying, well, that you're just assuming his style, then I've got written here other confirmation of how he is using the exact same style of conversation or language to make the same point. Look, the most important thing is that we don't try to pigeonhole people and put them under different schisms as to who's taught them or who baptized them or both. That's what he's trying to address here. Just as what he's saying here is, well, Paul taught all kinds of things that were beyond just the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So it's a style thing that makes a point.
And it's, I think the technical word is metonymy. And that's your $2 word for the day that might not be worth 2 cents. The whole point of you have a part that stands for the whole. And yes, it starts with Jesus and crucified, but then we get up to 1 Corinthians 12, and it talks about holding fast to the gospel which he preached. And then it includes the resurrection. So does that mean all he talked about was the cross and the crucifixion? Like, no. He's going to say, just for example, later on, chapter 5, verse 9, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Wait a minute. That goes way beyond the Lord's crucifixion and resurrection. It stands for the whole, and it's foundational. So here, the point is not you don't have to be baptized. It's what were you baptized into? In whose name were you baptized? Get back to Jesus. Follow the Lord. The personality issues that are happening, they need to address it. So, why did Paul not baptize them? He says it in verse 17, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. He says, verse 15, lest anyone should say that I had baptized in my own name. Did Paul know his audience? Was he going to give them any, and this is, if Jesus, we'll look at Jesus, if Jesus had baptized physically, if he had physically baptized himself, do you think anybody is going to be willing to be baptized by Peter? And the overall point is, when baptisms happen in the baptistry, how important is the other fella? We're there to make sure you don't drown. I'd say that flippantly. The important one is you who are being baptized and Jesus. That's who matters. And if that's who matters, then why are you following other people and other personalities and other teaching and breaking up into these divisions saying, I'm of this person, I'm of that person? Because that was happened, and this is the danger of following men there at the tail end of verse 17, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. If you follow someone other than the Lord, how effective is the cross in your life? It's just not effective. And that's the danger, and that's what Paul is trying to warn them about. To get back to our outline, the next question on page 3, the next application question was, what may have played a part in the divisiveness that was happening? And this list might be long, because I think a lot of things could have played a part. What may have played a part? And you can just think about everything that we've spoken about so far, or anything we haven't spoken about. What may have played a part in all of this?
For one thing,
Pride. They were puffed up, right? And we'll say this, how do you get divisiveness, and how do you get heretical teachers? How do you have, when Paul says, I have figuratively transferred these things to myself and Apollos, whoever it is who's going on here, and Paul says, when I come, now some are puffed up as though I were not coming to you. When I come to you, I will know those individuals who are being divisive. Pride is a part of that divisiveness. Well, I'm not getting my way. I want things done my way. It's all about me, me, me. I'm going to draw men. When Paul's talking to the Ephesian elders, and he says, there will be some who come in among the flock, drawing men to themselves. Why would you draw men to yourselves? Pride. Go ahead, Ms. Joy.
Well, I was just going to say that that's a loss. They've lost their focus. That's why the quarreling. That's why the person following. And that's why he says in verse 17, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power.
Right.
Christ is our focus, not me, not you, not them. If we keep our eyes on Christ, we're not going to have as much hostility and quarreling. And I mean, not that, everybody's on a different level. That isn't. It would be great if that
Different
took it
talents.
completely away.
Different talents.
But yeah, the
Right.
focus has
There
to
are
be
those
Christ.
who are immature. There are those who are medium mature. They're
Right. But the focus needs to always be geared back to Christ. That's the point.
Paul is going to he's going to use the illustration here in a little bit of a master builder. And he's going to say, I laid the foundation. Right? This is chapter 3, verse 9. We are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building. According to the grace of God, which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation. What's the foundation? It's Jesus Christ and Him crucified. But he's going to say, be careful. No other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, right? Gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work, okay? He's going to say, within verse 10, I have laid the foundation and another builds on it, but let each one take heed how he builds on it. You better be on the foundation. If the foundation is, I'm of this, I'm of that, whoa, that's, something's going off, something's going wrong with the building is the problem. And it's like you have a foundation and the building happens, but then people start adding on to the foundation. And then you start building onto that annex foundation. It's like, no. What's going on here with the building? Something's wrong. You have to get back and you have to focus on these foundational matters. What else might have played a part? Go ahead, Barry.
Jews and Gentiles.
Big one. Huge. You have Jews like Peter. I've never eaten anything unclean, right? This is going to play a huge part in this discussion about liberties. They're coming from different cultures, and they probably look different. They're eating different things, and all of a sudden, the wall of separation is torn down, and you smack them together. And then you're surprised, and the Lord's not surprised when, how are Jews and Gentiles going to get along? He's trying to say, this is how you get along. Are you really surprised, though? You think the Lord's really surprised when Jews and Gentiles have so much trouble getting along? He's not surprised. That's why he says, I have other sheep who are not of this fold. I will get them, and we will be one flock. Okay. This is going to be, are you going to have to go through growing pains? Oh, yeah. Culture. Another aspect of culture that we touched on in the intro, whenever it was, even the Gentiles, what was their cultural background in paganism? And think Athens. You go to Athens, and what do you have the streets lined with? All these different idols. Hey, you don't like this idol? Worship at another idol. I mean, I think in Athens 2,000 years ago, the carriages, the horse-drawn carriages going by probably had a sign on the back that said, worship at the idol of your choice. Because that's what was happening. Hey, you don't like this one? Go to this one. You don't like that one? Go to that one. Is it any surprise if you have that mindset and you've been raised in that mindset, when you come into the church, guess what? Hey, you don't like this teacher? Go to this teacher. You don't like... And it's the same mindset. It's culture. It's background. History. You think that played a part? Probably so. Probably so. What else might have played a part? Go ahead.
I say blessings. Actually, the different speaking in tongues and
Different gifts?
yeah, the gifts that they had.
Oh, and this one's interesting. Where did the gifts come from? They're gifts of the Holy Spirit. But could even those have played a role in this divisiveness that was happening? You have different members, yet when you get up to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, you have that whole discussion of, well, one's an ear, one's an eye, one's a nose. And you're saying you don't need them? It's talking about the gifts. Oh, you speak in tongues, but you don't think you need someone to interpret? And you think one gift is better than another gift. That's why when Paul, in talking about the gifts, and he's like, yeah, the gifts are awesome. He says, I'm going to show you a more excellent way. There's coming a time where you will not have even these different gifts. There's going to come a time where it's going to be love, faith, hope. Can everybody have love? Can everybody have faith? Can everybody have hope? And when Paul talks about it, and he says, when I was a child, I thought as a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child. And then what happened? When I grew up, I put away childish things, and I matured effectively. And what did the Corinthians need to do? And that points to something else, immaturity. Could immaturity have played a part in all this? Go ahead, Ashley. You can talk while I type.
I was thinking that it kind of reminds me of Matthew 23, where he's talking to the scribes and Pharisees. And so priorities, just different priorities to people. You know, the scribes and Pharisees were so big about weighing these teeny tiny, mint and the dill and the cumin, but they weren't concerned with the weightier matters of the law.
Yeah, faith. What's listed there? It's like faith, justice, and mercy. Some other things, just since I heard the bell ring. Do you think wealth could play a part in all this? 1 Corinthians 6, what are they doing? They're suing one another. So I think wealth could have played a part. On my list, I don't even know if I can see if I can. Jew, Gentile.
Quotes too, we talked about that earlier. Different personalities tend to mesh with one another more easily. we're a group, and you're not part of us.
Right. You might look up at the screen. That last one. Weak faith, strong faith. That probably goes to immaturity as well. I'm probably repeating myself. We'll close with this one. And that actually plays a part in it as well. Was knowledge playing a part in these divisions that were happening? Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And that points to another thing. And I promise, I don't know where my words are going. Lack of love. Is that ultimately what it is? Right? Can all of those things, different gifts, we'll say different abilities now. Gifts are different from abilities, all right? Abilities are not the same thing as spiritual gifts. But can all of those things that we've talked about, can they still, we'll come back to this Wednesday, can they still be issues today? Yeah, we'll come back to that. Appreciate everyone's help, comments, questions, everything this morning. Good to see everyone.